and the executive director of Asbel Support Initiative, a non-governmental organization committed to ending sexual violence through massive awareness campaign. And Noah is going to be moderating the panel session today. Noah is a PhD student of media, culture, and communication at New York University. His research is situated in Nigeria, where he's interested in digital ethnographic study of social media and the imbrication of local practices, epistemes, and explanatory principles. He's currently working on the spectacle of violence, mapping out the iterations of violence on both physical and online spaces. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. And I look forward to the interesting conversations we'll be having. And so I'll hand over to Noah to moderate the session.
Thank you very much, Bukumi. I am going to start right away. I just wanted to inform us all that we're going to be having very interesting dialectical conversations around certain case studies that have erupted on Nigerian digital spaces to determine whether there is a culture of violence online. And I would very much, we are all, familiar with this space. All of the panelists have been here before, so we know how it goes. At certain point in the conversation, we're going to open up the floor for questions, from the audience. So I would start with the general question. I'm going to ask all the panelists, to just give us a brief, introduction on whether they believe there's a digital culture of violence online. What do we think? Do we believe that Nigerians, do we believe that Nigerians have a culture of violence online? So all the panelists will just, speak for a brief moment, about 5 minutes each, just to open the floor. I would like to begin with dear Kara, if you don't
mind. Thank you very much, Noah, for that question, and thank you all for having me. It's a really nice thing to be back here. So I think to answer the question about violence in relation to digital spaces, there are 3 points or digital spaces in Nigeria. I think there are 3 points of context that are important to give around the answer I'll give to your question, whether I think there's violence. So the first thing I think is the need to analytically uncode violence. Like, what exactly do we mean when we invoke the word violence? Is it the kind of discursive formation that Nigerians use when they say, violence with a W in the middle, like the kind of banter mode, the discursive violence that people, throw back and forth? Or is it the kind of more constrained idea of violence as harm, physical or emotional harm? Or is it the space between those two things, what some people just dismiss as banter online, and the potentiality in that for causing like actual forms of harm? The second thing is, I think that instead of the kind of constraining around social media, is to think about how what we might think of as violence in social media emerges within broader relations of subjectivity that are tied to like offline modes of belonging. So we think about how there are prior tensions that shape what we recognize or what emerges as violence on social media. Tensions regarding ethnicity, regarding gender, regarding class, regarding generations. And so it's not a question of whether violence is inherent in that space in itself, but it's emergent through all these other modes of prior tensions that then come to be mediated in this space that we know as the digital. And then the final thing is the Nigerianness of it. And I would really be curious to hear from other panelists. Since we live in the digital age or all around the world, is there something specifically Nigerian to, the digital violence that we're talking about here? And so given those three context, I think my response to that will be, I'm a bit ambivalent about whether or not we can define those spaces as inherently violent. I think there's the potentiality for violence. I think prior tensions, like I said, relating to other forms of subjectivity, other issues of structural violence in offline context, precipitate how violence emerges on the digital space. And I think because the digital space is so highly mediated in the way that it is, it sets the stage for future entailments of violence in other contexts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, dear Kara. I am going to go straight to Destiny. Destiny.
Hi. I have to quickly apologize for not showing my face. I can see your very winsome faces. Unfortunately, I can't show mine because I'm having a boss man's weekend. I have been working pretty much all night, and you know the way these things go. So I don't want to unnecessarily alarm you guys with what my face looks like this morning. To your question, I think I'll take a bit more a more pragmatic approach to this conversation altogether, partly because I have been, for the most part, a victim of online violence. So unlike dear Kara, who just gracefully compartmentalized the discourse into three, three edges, I would go right to say yes to your question. There is a culture of violence, and I believe that because first, on a broader scale, social media is essentially life. People might have the opinion that, well, you get this rhetoric from time to time. Social media is not real life. But I mean, obviously, it's either people don't mean that or they are just being very short-sighted when they say that, because essentially we live a substantial part of our lives these days on social media. You could literally be at home the whole day and you spend like maybe 12 hours on your phone on different social media platforms, curating what you want people to see the same way you curate your life on a daily basis. So that's to say, any single point where you aggregate humans and they can express themselves in every sense of humanness, you are going to get essentially what you get pretty much everywhere else, and that includes violence. But I think Diakara raised a very important point, which is probably a more instructive driver for these conversations because we are Nigerians. And she said, she was curious to know if there is a specific brand of Nigerianness in this violence, in this conversation. And I think there is, but I have to measure and say that I only make bold to say so. It's not like I have any empirical evidence backing up what I just said. I believe the anecdotal evidence at least is pretty clear, because this is a cultural issue, right? If you're asking about whether there is a specific quote unquote Nigerianness, right, that pervades social media and then translates in the form of violence, you are essentially asking a sociocultural question, because you could basically say the same for Americans. Is there a brand of violence that we could describe as being American? If you ask such a question, you're essentially raising a sociocultural issue. And I think for Nigerians, it's not particularly because we want to be consciously violent or that we are consciously violent. I think from a cultural standpoint, two things. One is a lot of Nigerians, because of the culture that we have, which has the negatives of which have metastasized because of the kind of government that we have. I think a lot of persons are moving with a lot of ingrained anger in them. And anger, like the psychologists would say, is a secondary emotion, right? There is always a much deeper emotion driving that anger. And people would occasionally throw these things out at you because there's only so much that they can hold within themselves. People are angry that, their salaries are not enough to cater to their basic needs. People are mad that just a lot of things are going wrong in the country. Some persons are frustrated. They want to leave to this other side of the world. Dollar is 1,400. All of that anger must find an outlet. It's just basically the way humans are. And that's why I say there has to be a brand of Nigerianness in the kind of violence that we witness. And that is specific to Nigerians because of the peculiarities of our problems. And another reason why I think that this exists is, and the reason I tied it to culture is, we also have a culture of subservience, respectability politics. You know, on a day-to-day, a lot of persons are not able to vent their spleen. You know, you are in the office, you can't tell your boss certain things because you are scared, or because your boss is an old 60-year-old Yoruba man who expects you to genuflect pretty much every time you say anything, right? So people need an outlet to express these things that they've been holding back, things that culture may not necessarily expect them to hold back. And that's why you find in the Nigerian subculture, you find things like baddies, you find things like feminists. Now, these are now terms we use to describe people who try to be unconventional. Now, this unconventionality is stemming from the fact that on a day-to-day, they may not just be able to express themselves in certain ways, but social media presents the opportunity for them to express themselves. And in the course of doing that, we get a certain brand of quote unquote violence that other persons may not be able to relate to. A typical American may be like, why are these people very loud? Why did you put it that way? That sounded very violent or very aggressive. It's just because of the peculiarity of the problems we face, both on from a governance perspective and also from a much steeper cultural perspective, which then influences the way we express ourselves online. So yeah, to summarize, I would say, Noah, to your question, I believe very strongly, and I have to be partly sentimental about it, because I have been at the receiving end of, you know, a large variety of violence online. So I would say yes to your question, and I think I've been able to at least shed some light to the question dear Kara gracefully brought to bear, which is whether or not there is a specific there is some level of Nigerianness in the way that we describe these things. Yeah.
No, you're muted.
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't know that. So I was saying thank you, Destiny and dear Kara, for that wonderful submission. I'm going to come to Azana soon, but before I do that, I just want to point out that I'm going to come back to one of the panelists to ask, you know, if there is, I mean, like you all, both of you pointed out, you know, that there is something Nigerian, there's something Nigerian that is also violent that we express online, but without wanting to pathologize, you know, violence to the Nigerian digital subjects themselves. You know, how do we begin to unpack the different forms of violence that are being performed online? So like I said, I'm going to come back to you, either one of you, for that. But let's hear from Azana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I think to answer your question, I might not be able to go the academic route, like my sister that is doing her PhD has gone. But I think I'll just want to look at Twitter, you know, as a platform. And mostly, I think I'd look at Twitter, I'd look at Instagram, and perhaps LinkedIn. Mostly, I think violence always comes when someone says something or someone does something, you know, and then the next thing the person is getting cooked, you know, in the young people's parlance. Or when someone believes in something, or when someone shares, you know, their ideology on a particular thing, you know, and then they get cooked. So, you know, people start threatening you. To some extent, we have extreme instances where, you know, your house address is being shared, you know. And I think on another way, you know, we still see that, you know, when people agree with you, you know, they end up giving you money, you know, or they end up starting a GoFundMe or, you know, whatever, you know, for you. But I think when we look at violence, I think I'd like to look at it from the perspective of maybe sexual violence. And I think that's an area that I'm very passionate about. You know, that's why I'm also running a nonprofit that mainly focuses on that. And I think because as a society, we do not really even come to grasp, like, you know, what sexual violence is, and, you know, how that is perceived, you know, and even in our physical spaces, then that gets mirrored, you know, even in digital space. Like for instance, yesterday I saw on Twitter where a woman went with her child to do a jam registration, and she put her number. And the person that was doing the registration decided to take the girl's number, assuming that it was the girl's number, not knowing that he was chatting with her mother. And I mean, if someone is writing jam, she's about 15, 16, and then he kept on trying to get her to speak to her, to say he likes her, and all those normal predator vibes that some older men carry. And this is like, and then this came on Twitter, she was ranting on Twitter and she was angry about the situation. And I also saw disappointing comments, from some people saying, because in all of it, there's so much to unpack. There's the data protection that we don't take seriously, which is now very glaring, when you look at this story and how it unfolds in digital space, and then there's also the issue of violence and sexual violence and harassment and consent, and all of that just are different conversations, that we can, all unpack. But I think fundamentally, it just goes down to how we are, even in the offline space. But yes, I will agree that, on the online space, it becomes, it becomes bigger, it becomes more prominent, you tend to see it more. And I think that's because of, the level of anonymity that, being in an online space gives you, So it kind of emboldens you to do much more than, you naturally would do if you're not seeing the person. But of course, we've recorded quite a number, of violence, especially sexual violence against women, on the online space. We've seen cases of stalking, we've seen cases, so many plethora of cases, of women. And I think it also, like I said earlier, mirrors back to our society and how we view women and women's safety. So I think just to wrap it up, I would say yes, there is a certain level of violence, but I think I'm going to agree with dear Kara. I don't, Destiny is second speaker. I cannot for certain say it's unique to like a Nigerianness. I think we just kind of know that because of the algorithm. So like when you're in a particular location, everything just kind of, your content just kind of, revolves around, that. So you end up finding yourself on Nigerian Twitter, so like people's opinion and everything just revolves around how Nigerians think and what Nigerians say. But I think it's kind of like every country has its peculiarness, on this issue. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Hasna, for that. I'm very much happy that you raised sexual and gender-based violence that we see, take place online. I'm going to come back to you on that, especially because of one of the issues that was raised in Nanjala Nyabola's book, which is Digital Democracy, Analog Politics in Kenya, where Nanjala was arguing that there is no difference between the sort of violence we find in physical spaces and the reinterpretation of those violence performances online. So thank you very much for raising that. I'm going to go to Dear Kara, and I would like you to talk about state's performance of violence. In my own personal work, I'm trying to look at I'm trying to map out the iterations of violence, the sort of violence that is being performed by political elites, the sort of violence that is being performed by, state apparatuses, and how that form of violence is also reinterpreted and also interpolated by Nigerian digital subject. You have written about the James Brown scenario, they didn't cut me in very brilliant paper. And earlier this week, the Nigerian State Police spokesperson, Olumuyiwa Adejobi, released a statement online to as a response to the trending challenge that was jumped on by some queer Nigerians. Adejobi claimed that the persons in the video would be prosecuted. And I would like you to talk about the implications of the presence of state apparatuses like Nigerian police force online, especially one with a history of violence? What are the implications of having state apparatuses online?
Thank you so much for that question. No, I think it's a really important one. And the reason why I was trying to draw in my initial response was trying to still keep that digital space tied to an offline space, not saying that either one has primacy over the other, but to show that interconnected nature of power itself and how violence works in many of those spaces. I think the James Brown example is a very, very interesting one, because it sort of shows like the kind of ways in which the state itself, having quote unquote the legitimacy to violence, being able to further legitimize that on media platforms. And so like with queer people, from every now and then you have like extensive media trials where, you know, they are forced to speak or defend themselves before a range of actors, of media actors, and this gets reproduced on social media. This gets, you know, I think, Noah, you had said something about the spectacle. This moment becomes the moment of spectacle, where the states can sort of announce the bodies that are othered, or the bodies that are transgressive in the imaginary of the states. And so I think the big point for emphasizing the extremely mediatized nature of like social media context is to show how, you know, these moments of spectacle can then reach like farther than they ordinarily would. In some of the literature on the spectacle, it was about public floggings, it was about you know, public hangings, that kind of display of violence. But now the individual is being hung for a public or an audience raised to the power of 100, because, you know, many people have access to these platforms. Many people can see the statement, and it sort of constitutes a warning for other potential actors that look what happens when you are this person, when you are this individual. And thanks for mentioning Nyabola's work, and also as Hazana's points about gender, is to see that even within the spaces, like the platforms, we're talking about Twitter now primarily, within those platforms where we think there's a chance for a more democratized public sphere, we still have hierarchies of who has more platform, who can say what. And the states, you know, many times the state is invested in so many actors that can actually, you know, spread the word further. So it's different from the power of an individual to speak on this platform. It's different from whether the individual is poor or middle class or rich. So there's a hierarchy to which people can even leverage that social media space. And the state, you know, has this upper hand because, you know, the state always has the resources to legitimize their forms of violence. So I think talking about the state allows us to think about the hierarchies of presence or hierarchies of legitimacy, even on these platforms that we're talking about, the legitimacy to incite violence, to display violence, or to even, you know, validate it as something that, well, we're the state, so we're the law, we can do this to people.
Thank you very much, Dekara, for that. I really like how you brought the whole concept of legitimizing violence to your submission, and which would also lead me to the question I'm going to ask Destiny next. How does the metaphorical become the real? How does violence itself becomes democratized in a sense? How does it become legitimized? I think it was in I've forgotten the year exactly when Buhari, made a statement online that is going to use the same language. something about the language, about how the Middle Eastern force, I forget exactly, the exact how you frame the post, but something about enforcing, just not to ramble. I'm going to go next to Destiny and ask, how the metaphorical becomes the real. Like prior to the general elections, the incumbent president as a presidential aspirant, was seen declaring that it was it's time to ascend presidency with the viral slogan, "Imilokon," which in English translates to "It's my turn." So this statement soon became ethnic and political points of reference for Nigerians. Everyone was like, "Oh, it's my turn to," the Yorubas were like, "Oh, it's our own turn to." People were also buying into that slogan to self identify with what that slogan promises. The 2024 slogan on Nigerian digital space is "No grief for anybody." So this statement, like others, has been taken both literally and metaphorically. As a public figure yourself, Destiny, how do you see this play out? How does the metaphorical become real? And what are the repercussions for this?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I might even need a minute to digest it. But off the cuff, I would say, knowing Nigerians and just by being Nigerian myself, I think I think it's even more likely to become real faster than it might probably be in other places. And I will tell you why I believe that. Just to answer the first limb of your question, how does the metaphorical become real? I think it's just when you allow a level of impunity and then it goes unpunished, it is very likely that anything metaphorical would become real. It's not just a case of oh, this is something that people believe on a virtual level. It becomes the reality of people when the more they say it, the more it is accepted, the more it becomes part of their daily life. I find it very interesting because just yesterday I was reading a piece. There's this contemporary philosopher who said something about reality that was really chilling. He said he defined reality as nothing more than a culturally sanctioned, linguistically reinforced hallucination. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point he was saying is people can create reality. People create their reality every single day, or at least a group of people, a culture, a people, right? And they do that by, expressing an idea, reinforcing that idea by language. They keep saying it again and again and again. And then it becomes absorbed. It becomes culturally sanctioned, right? So going back to your question, if you think about violence on the digital space, I don't even think we can say fairly at this point that it is merely metaphorical. It is already real. And the reason it is real, especially in the Nigerian context, is because the Nigerian culture allows for a lot of things, to go on with impunity. The reason a president could come out, for instance, and say, or a presidential aspirant and say, Emiloko, and get the backing of many people, including statesmen, people who are highly educated, there's also a layer, a sliver of culture to that. It's the culture of, you have to respect certain people, regardless of what you think about their morals and, the ethics of their ambitions or whatnot. There's just a level of respect embedded in, our society that drives certain things faster than they probably would in other places. It's that level of impunity that makes a lecturer say, you know what, nobody's getting an A in this course and you can't do anything about it. It's the same level of impunity that will make a lecturer say, hey, I heard your complaints. You said you didn't get an F in this course, but unfortunately, I can't just go back to mark any script. So take it next semester. And nothing is just going to happen. You'll be surprised that you might report that person to another elder, and they will find you disrespectful for reporting the person. So the point I'm trying to make here is, on a broader scale, just as human beings, right? The metaphorical becomes real when there is the absence of sanctions. You are not punishing a thing. It morphs gradually from being just a metaphor to the reality of people. But in a system where you already have layers of, cultural behaviors that instantiates those things, it grows faster. And I think we have that culture in Nigeria. There is this level of there's a level of impunity that we have sort of gotten used to. Sometimes we even validate it and we even support it, whether consciously or unconsciously, depending on maybe certain other sentiments like tribal affiliations, religious affiliations, or whatnot. But the overall point is there are certain things that we support that makes it very, very easy and common for some of these dangerous ideas to become our reality. And I think they have in fact become our reality. Things like online violence, right? You find young people come online and say very nasty things that they would otherwise not say, because it can be, on some level, you could say, well, it's just the way Nigerians banter. We have a culture that somehow solidifies these things as we move. It becomes really, really quick for anybody to say, oh, yeah, this thing is normal. I mean, people have been doing it, or people have been saying it, so I might as well just act on it. For you raised the no grief for anybody slogan. Obviously, that's a statement that's supposed to be a metaphor. You just apply it to different facets of your life, not necessarily taking it literally, right? But I would tell you that if people were to take that literally and behave in certain ways, you would find a mammoth crowd of persons in Nigeria who wouldn't really find anything wrong with it, because we have a culture of cementing certain ideas very quickly, because we don't have that sense of impunity, or that sense of that how would I put it now, that sense of the far-reaching implications of our immediate actions. We just tend to take a lot of things as how we describe them as just vibes, and that has become a culture. It's not just something that one person says or 100 people say. At least I've used spaces like Twitter long enough to know that these things have become our reality, our online reality. At least this is how people behave. If you introduce something to the Nigerian community, it quickly becomes the norm. It quickly becomes our reality, simply because we have a culture of taking things, or we have a culture of just behaving in a way that shows a total disregard for, maybe consequences, generally speaking. And when you have that culture, however slim you might think it is, it really turns things quickly. Most of the things you would think, oh, this is not our reality right now, you will be very surprised how fast those things become our reality. And I think that's already the case in Nigeria. The only way, and maybe not the only way, but one way I think we can, maybe reduce the extent to which we normalize certain things that are maybe violent or aggressive or toxic, is when you begin to attach real consequences to these things. And I don't think our culture has gotten to that point yet. Unfortunately, though it trickles from top to bottom. Almost every single place you get into, you find that level of impunity amongst the educated, amongst the uneducated. And so it really hastens the extent to which many of the quote unquote abnormal behaviors, these aggressive behaviors become the reality. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Destiny. When you talked about language as reality, I was thinking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, where he talked about language encompassing culture and also language encompassing reality. Yeah. And how does this reality itself become seen, and how do we even take this reality itself? How do people engage with this form of reality? When Diakara was talking on an opening statement, she said that prior tensions, how do prior tensions, give room for ethnic diversity and, even class diversity, political diversity. I would like to use that to ask my next question to Hasana, especially because of the fact that you actively campaigned for Atiku Abubakar during the 2023 general elections. You at certain points also granted interviews I think I saw the one on Al Jazeera and other media outlets. I bet you were not popular among young people for your choice of candidates. You, like other young people, suffered similar backlash and criticism for supporting mainstream political party. There were a lot of people who were disenfranchised for the choices they made during the elections. What does this mean for Nigerian democracy, especially for young people who believed that the choice within the mainstream political party was anti-youth, anti-progressive?
I think I'm going to try to decenter myself to have this conversation. I think my worry was when certain politicians had the idea that social media is not real life. But I think with the coming of beavers, which made it quite complicated to kind of like pad the number of people in certain states, we could easily now see how, you know, when people are popular in certain places, you know, when people are overwhelmingly popular in certain places, you know, how social media affects that popularity, you know, how social media drives that popularity. So I think just, you know, a sidebar to those that will be contesting in 2027, to me, you know, maybe take the online space seriously. But I think when we now look at, you know, certain people's choices, you know, and how people were bullied for their choices, I think primarily it made me worry for the idea of, you know, because I feel like perhaps, like, you know, Destiny would say, sometimes we say something and then we mean another thing, you know. So even when we want to overhaul a system, you know, I think it's a Nigerian thing of the things don't really. I'm trying to gather my words. I wish I'm a PhD student and I have ample of English words in my. But yeah, you know, it's like if it doesn't affect me, or if it's not favoring me, then it's a problem. But then once it favors me, then it's not a problem. So now, for instance, we all do not like, you know, autocracy. We all do not like, you know, dictatorship. We all do not like a world that is not without democracy. We love the ideals of democracy. But then if democracy doesn't allow people to see things in my point of view, then all of a sudden I don't want democracy anymore. And I think that was part of the conversation that I tried to keep on having with young people over and over and over again. Because what I found during that time was it was kind of difficult to even ask difficult questions, because of, you know, the herd mentality, it was kind of difficult to even hold certain people accountable. And coming from the north, I have seen this kind of followership, and it doesn't end well. If anything, it ends with a Buhari as a president. You know, when people have certain people that, you know, push for it, that make it seem like it's almost blasphemy for you to not support this candidate, that it makes it look like, you know, you're almost sinning, you know, for you to not see this person as a messiah. In my experience, it really doesn't end well. It doesn't end, you know, with anything sustainable, because once you make gods out of people, you know, then it's not a system that works, especially in a polarized country like ours. And that was, I think, for me, the most interesting thing. And, you know, the conversation that I tried so hard to have, it wasn't even about me as a person. It was about how can we ensure that, you know, yes, this is a popular choice, but how can we still have conversations around it? You know, how can we come back to the table and make hard calculations and make hard decisions? And I find that, you know, there was so much emotions, you know, that was overladen during the time, that it was kind of difficult, like, to have these conversations, you know. And everything, now that everything has doused down and, you know, people are beginning to see certain things, it's now like, oh, if we had done things differently, perhaps we would have found, you know, a common ground. And I hope 2027 we're able to sit down, and have these conversations. Because another thing I've also found about politics is it's not a walk in the park. It's a place you must make difficult decisions. If not, you're going to keep on, staying in an idealistic world, where it would be, oh, this person would have been, this person would have been. But if you really want to, especially become a president in this polarized country, then you must be able to come to the table, and make consensus and, have conversations, and see how you can make deals with even people that you naturally cannot stand. And yes, those people you naturally cannot stand involves people that you think have not done well for the country. It involves people that you think, the old people. But like I said, I'm always going to try to decenter myself, because I think I've always had this problem with older generation and younger generation. I remember even when I was much younger, and I talk about feminism, and I'm always like, oh, but then the older women are patriarchy princess, or the older women, but I think one thing that, age and wisdom would sort of give to you is nuance. You begin to see that at the end of the day, people are just surviving, and you cannot crucify people for just finding ways to survive. So at the end of the day, I've learned, because I think now that I've calmed down, I have gotten lots of experience and wisdom from those people that, those women that are older, those women I don't agree with, those women that hold opinions that I feel is very sexist and harmful. But still, I have learned from them. And I think that's just the beauty of being able to survive in a polarized world. And I think that's what democracy is able to give us. But we then have found ourselves in a world where, especially what happened, the most unfortunate event of 2023 elections, where it was kind of difficult to even hold certain opinions. It was kind of difficult to even, before you know it, you're shut down. You might just say, oh, I want Atiku Abubakar to become president. And before you know it, someone that doesn't know you from anywhere is calling you stupid, is calling you foolish, I hold a master's. Some people said I was not educated. Good for them. But at the end of the day, for us to build, a certain level, and I also saw someone's comment saying we don't have a democracy. Whatever the case is, we cannot have a like it's a journey, you have to build it. And what happened in 2023 is not, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think it's one way to building a democracy, because we literally saw online bullying, we literally saw, people being threatened, we literally saw, and to some extent it might just be words, but it was real life threats, people were threatened for their political choices. And yes, people might do it across board, but it's a conversation. So and that's why I didn't point a finger at any, political party or whatever, because I think it's something that everyone needs to learn to hold themselves accountable on, that your choice, even if it's the popular choice, you still be able to give room, to have conversations. Because at the end of the day, if you want to topple this government, then we must be able to all sit down on the table and speak without condescension, and whatnot. So yeah, basically that's what I think I would say on the question you asked. Hope I've been able to answer.
Thank you very much, Sana. That was brilliantly put. You talked about herd mentality, crowd effect, and the fact that sometimes, in a sense, we become what we fight, that we can't eat our cake and have it. I would like to ask Deaka to speak to the whole herd effect, herd mentality, crowd effect, especially given the fact that in 2020, Nigerian youth, trooped out both online and physical spaces to fight against extrajudicial killing, by SARS. Recently, which was last year, I believe, you attended one of the candlelights concerts held from Mohbad. The circumstances surrounding the death of Mohbad was epiphanic for Nigeria. Epiphanic, yeah, for Nigerians, and the attendant reactions by the public, where people were calling for the prosecution, digital courts, and the cancel culture around, the reactions to, certain people were asked to be brought to book. So do you think the Mohbad movement demonstrated the adversity attached to bullying, both online and on digital spaces, in physical spaces, sorry?
Thanks so much for that question, Noah. And thank you so much, Hassana, for that response, because I think you've touched on, as a general comment, you've touched on so many of the crucial elements of thinking about, crowd thinking, mob thinking, that I think we need to unpack today, and to see that many of our experiences of, public sphere engagement is continually removed from, models of discourse where people can actually listen to each other, even in the context of disagreement. And it's such an important point because with social media, in the past, we had more streamlined public spheres where it was supposed to be a cohort of often just educated, privileged, often male too. And, these people were expected to make the decisions or to decide things. And now we have a massification, if you like, of the public sphere, which is a good thing on the one hand. But on the other hand, a lot that goes on has more to do with, affects, the emotions of the crowd, than dealing with, platforms where we can actually talk to each other and see if we can have models of political mobilization that are then sustainable. So you see with some of the movements that we've had following like social media outreach, they've not been sustainable because in many ways they were pushed through by affect, by emotion, rather than, settled engagement with one another, listening to one another, and actually sitting down to sit with the discomfort, which is what Hassana was pointing to. So to give, of course, we all know the examples of NSARS and MOBAD. I was at the candlelight scene, the rally they had in starting at the Lekki toll gate and moving to towards Memorial Park, I think. And I think that was on the 22nd of September last year, following his death. And we could see that in the moment of, the kind of social media outrage, there's a sense in which you get that young people are constantly finding outlets to invest their energies into. So we don't have a model of like an organized or institutional arrangement of mobilization that allows many young people to express these things. And I think Destiny already made that point in his initial response. And so what happened was, people moving out en masse, a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened and whatnot. But there were elements of truth. These theories are not just theories out of thin air. And I'm saying that I think I need us to also be careful about, dismissing the herd as this unthinking crowd. Because I talked to many people at the scene, and what happens is a kind of collective moment where people are rallying together to say something together. But each individual has their idea of why they are there, has their idea of why they feel like they belong, this kind of public space for mobilization, articulate some of the challenges they're facing. So it's not just that, everyone is moving like a kind of zombie onto something. People are also finding ways to rationalize their position in the world. And I think what we need to do is not to dismiss the energies of mobilization that, this moment gives us, but to think, as Hassan has noted, on how we can sit down at the table and really rationalize what we want from this moment, how we want to leverage on them, and how, even when we disagree, we don't have to harm one another by saying that, your idea means that, you no longer can have a space at this table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kara. For that, I think it's very much important that we are having these conversations, and because it's very much important to talk through these difficult case studies that I've brought up. And when we were talking the other time, I think it was both Dekra and Destiny that were speaking about the Nigerianness of violent performances online. Destiny Destiny spoke about his personal experiences, with bullying, online harassment, and aggression. There's this very important book I read, which I think also speaks to this briefly. Edward Said's Representations of the Intellectual. And one of the quotes I really liked there was that one task of the intellectual is the effort to break down the stereotypes and reductive categories that are so limiting to human thought and communication. The stereotypes about Nigerians are disconcerting, and there is the fear that some of these conversations we are having, about violence might pathologize the cultural performances of Nigerians online. So I would like to ask you, Destiny, I have witnessed a Twitter exchange between you and another user a long time ago, where you were trying to put forward your opinion and make a stand for what you believed in. Do you believe, as Said claims to, that it is the role of the intellectual to break down the stereotypes and reductive categories on digital spaces?
Yes, absolutely. And I say that because it has simply been the role of intellectuals for the longest time. I mean, I don't know any other way you would describe an intellectual if they are not doing that. But I think the problem there is, I don't know how accommodating the social media world, especially in the Nigerian context, is to intellectuals. So it can be frustrating and also desensitizing as well. But yeah, I believe that is primarily the role of the intellectual. It is essentially you putting yourself forward and saying, hey, you don't believe in something or you think something should change, and you begin to have that tough conversations that would lead to changes you may not even witness yourself. It's obviously a thankless job, but that is essentially the role of an intellectual. We are having an increasing spate of intellectuals recently, at least in my experience on Twitter, and that is a good thing. It's a good thing because I think a lot of conversations need to be had. The other day, I happened on a very, very interesting conversation on Twitter, and I partook. I said a couple of things, but this is not even about me. It was about this young lady. Her name is Ifia Dere. Or I hope I'm not killing that name, but I think that was her name, or the name I saw. She raised a very interesting conversation, and the conversation stemmed from, I don't know if you saw this video that went viral one time. It was Chimamanda. So she was saying that she was narrating an experience she had in her hometown where they were in this meeting and they said only men should break kola nuts. Women should not be allowed to break kola nuts. And she asked why. She asked the simple why. And, many of the elders said, oh, no, women don't break kola nuts. You just imagine the typical Nigerian traditional setting. And eventually, they told her, you know what, we may not allow you to break the kola nut, but you can at least bless it or something like that. And then she did. And she was using that as a point of reference to say, there are just a bunch of things that people do, people have normalized, people believe is culture that they don't revisit because people don't challenge them. And then the whole of Twitter went kumbaya. The Igbo section for Twitter, it went kumbaya. Men and women were saying, oh, she's so petty. There are better issues to talk about. She's here talking about kola nuts and who should break kola nuts. Men don't talk about these things because, they castigated that men, for instance, have to pay bride prices. All of these things. They don't complain. Why is she complaining about something so tangential? And then this lady I'm talking about, she's Igbo, and she raised a very interesting conversation. And the conversation was, why don't men question the payment of bride prices? It's not logical to say, well, because a woman is asking for certain rights, she should keep quiet because men don't ask for certain rights. Why don't the men ask for those rights? It's just logically inconsistent to use that as, a counter argument. And because she was Igbo, or she's Igbo rather, she came under this very heavy backlash. People ripped her to shreds. But what was interesting, and why I'm even mentioning this in the context of my response to your question, is she did not wilt. It went on for like a week. People were dragging her, saying she has been Americanized, all of this crazy stuff that Nigerians would say. But no, she responded to most of the attacks very sensibly, quietly. She did not insult anybody. She just kept responding. I was so, I don't know, I was so impressed. I was impressed, I was inspired, and some of us had to join her and, amplify what she was saying, because what she was essentially saying is, we need a culture of questioning. And I had this conversation one time at Harvard. It was during the presidential elections. So we had this political conversation, cultural conversation at Harvard. And I was telling people that I remember sharing there that one way to understand the functionality of culture is to simply ask yourself what you are doing today that is consciously and meaningfully targeted at the future. People talk about culture and the preservation of certain cultural practices, because when you look at a lot of things in hindsight, they sound as things that were very, very intended. It's just the way, even in the scientific world, someone goes back and says, Einstein must have been so intentional in laying the groundwork for what we know today as, theory of relativity and whatnot. Someone might say, oh, Charles Darwin must have been so intentional, about laying the groundwork for, the theory of evolution. But when you look at these people, or if you truly understand the history that brought about these people, you find that they were barely even intentional about these things. It was simply a case of Darwin just being naturally interested in these things. I read a story one time about how he wrote 1,400 letters to his friend, talking about just how he found it very interesting how everything came about. And then he spent the next 15 years writing his book, which, you threw the whole world of science into this form of awareness, right? It's the same thing. Einstein was sitting in his office in Prague as a patent intern when what he described eventually as the most beautiful thought he ever had came to his mind. He just thought to himself, if this guy trying to build that building across the street falls from the scaffolding, he is going to feel no weight at all while he's falling, which means the way that Newton explained gravity many years ago, it's not complete. And then he spent the next 8 years developing what we now know as the formula for the theory of relativity. It was not that Einstein was particularly concerned about the future and then he did something. When we look at things in hindsight, it always feels that way. It feels like our elders, they sat somewhere and they said, you know what, we are going to curate these cultural practices and this is how all our generations should lead. No. And the way you know that it's not true is for you to also ask yourself, what are you doing today that is so intended to affect your children in the next 100 years? Most of us don't wake up thinking, my actions today are going to have any impact on the people in the next 100 years. Your children in the next 100 years may look back and say, so there was really a time people were homophobic. It will be bizarre to them. But you are not consciously doing anything right now that should form the culture that they would believe in and uphold. And what that simply means is culture can be questioned, because the people who did, at least for the most part, who did these things, they did not exactly have you in mind when they were doing it. It just felt functional to them at that relevant point in time, and it became something that people did again and again and again. So she brought about a very, very controversial issue, and she was able to address it like a proper intellectual. I'm not even sure she would describe herself as an intellectual, but what she did that day is something that I would love to see more in spaces like that, because places like Twitter, Instagram, they are like melting pots for some of the brashest ideas that exist in our system, in our culture. You see the way people think in real time, and they are telling you. So it's a very thankless job. It's a difficult job trying to shape the ideas of people with all the knowledge you've accumulated, with all the observations that you've taken pains to, carry on. But that is in fact the function of intellectuals in our society. It is simply putting yourself forward and saying, you know what, I know to some extent that something is not right, and I will spend this amount of time trying to educate people on what I think is the case. And then I'll be prepared to take whatever challenges that come my way in terms of maybe intellectual challenges or just simply brash, abrupt resistance to the popularity of your ideas. It's taking a very stiff position and saying, I am going to ensure that no matter how, what's the word now? No matter the lack of pace it would take for people to understand whatever it is I am pushing, I am interested in making sure that there is a new understanding to this subject idea. And I think that is really just the function of intellectuals. The more we have them, the better it is for us, no matter how thankless the job is. So yeah, no, that would be my contribution. I'm sorry, I think I went off a little bit, I digressed a little bit, but I was just trying to make this point because that is simply what it has always been, at least in my understanding. And I think that is really just what intellectuals should be doing. Absolutely.
No, thank you very much. Listen, you touched every aspect I wanted you to talk about. You said that culture can be questioned. I believe cultures all over the world, can be questioned. This is how we become redefined as people. Now, why I said that we say is that we should question everything. Nothing should be too big or too nothing should be too big, for people to question. You also talked about intellectuals in our society, and I was very much interested in how intellectual discourses online, have created different parties, among people. We had the whole concept of Twitter feminist and how that is used as a derisive statement, to refer to people online who have feminist agenda and feminist stance. I wanted to use that to also talk about the recent event online with the Debbie case. I would like to ask Asana. So recently, a woman known as Debbie posted that she wakes up at 4:50 a.m. to prepare food for her husband, and Twitter went berserk, and people were having, divergent opinions about that. Oh, how do you wake up to cook for a man who probably doesn't care about you and would eventually cheat, And some people were like, oh, no, it's a choice, to do whatever she wants to do. A tweet went viral and generated both criticism and praises. So this is a minor example of the divided opinions, formed around choices women make and how their presence online is also being interpolated. So with your work, as Voy, right? Yeah. How is gender violence, performed on Nigerian digital spaces, and how are these discourses approached?
So, the whole conversation on Debbie has been an interesting one for me to notice. I'm sorry that my camera is off. I'm trying to drive and talk. Don't tell the road safety. But yeah, I think, and also it has to do with how we look at women. And I've always said in Nigeria, we look at women, or in Africa generally, we look at women as a homogeneous group, So, and then we give women just one aspiration. So we look at all women as people that should be good, whatever good means, in whatever context, And then that one aspiration that we allow for women is for women to aspire to be good women. So when you look at this issue with what happened with Deborah, it's just one person sharing her, what she does. She's not even saying, hey, wake up for your husband and do this. But knowing Nigeria and the way, because we can also not be hypocritical about these conversations. We know, it's the same Nigeria that men are beating their wives to death simply because she didn't make pap the way they wanted, their pap to be made. Last year I had a cousin that was killed because when she got back from a journey and she was about to use the washing machine. And, I would never have thought that. I look at these things on Twitter and it's always so, until it happened to me, like you sympathize with it, you get angry with it, but at the same time, it's hard to comprehend, but like when my cousin was killed by her husband because of domestic chores such as washing, it became interesting to me that these conversations are not just conversations, they are conversations that can be dangerous to women, and like I said earlier, when you as a woman, you're being raised by your mother, by your aunties, by everybody, by your father, by the whole society, that you should be a good woman, and you're also being raised, and then within the context of a good woman, within the context that society says a good woman should be, and you're also being raised to aspire to be just that person. Tweets like, or opinions like that of Debbie, becomes such a thing that it's now like, oh, it's setting a dangerous precedent, for other people. And to me, it wasn't harmful up until, brands started to fall on it, and to the extent that even, government agencies. And I'm like, but this is just supposed to be one person stating her opinion and how she does things. Why are brands, like, what messaging? And, I think it was Destiny or Dekara that mentioned something about government institutions being on Twitter, stuff legitimizing, what it means or, just legitimizing anything, so they put their mouth in certain conversations, and all of a sudden, it gives the conversation a certain level of weight, So these are things that we must, like, these are conversations that must be taken seriously at the end of the day. So, like I said, that has been my thought. This is, I think, probably the first time I'm having to articulate how I felt about it. But like, I think the only problem is because we look at every woman to be one kind of woman. If one woman is waking up at 4 a.m. to cook for her husband, how does that concern me if I'm not the kind of person that would do that? But knowing Nigeria and knowing our society, it would force you to become that woman, even if you're not interested in it. And that's why choice feminism has always been an interesting concept to me, because you cannot say choice feminism when people still do not have choices, when people are not even allowed to know that they have choices to make. So basically, that's my thought on it.
Thank you very much, Hasana. Touched on every point I wanted to say. I was expecting that you would talk about. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to ask all the panelists to give a closing remark a closing thought in just 2 minutes. I'm going to start with Kara, go to Destiny, then back to you, Hasana. So in 2 minutes, I just wanted to, give a closing thought. Then we open the floor to the audience. Kara.
Okay, thank you. It's been really good to be part of this conversation. So I think I'd started with like 3 analytical points that I've gotten a lot more perspective on now, and maybe to comment on the Nigerianness of the phenomena. So I'd asked that initially as a question, to say, is this a global, the idea of, herd mentality that's highly mediatized on social media that then becomes this big thing? Is it a Nigerian thing? And I think it's important to understand perhaps that in many other contexts, we experience these things in different kinds of ways. And so the particular conditions, structural conditions of being in Nigeria, not, having access to other platforms, like Destiny said, might make it seem like this is a Nigerian thing, but it's a global thing, reacting to our society in particular ways. And I think that about the question of herd mentality on social media, I think just to reiterate that it's important, on the one hand, for as people who are potentially part of the herd, to think about ways we can, as individuals, participate in these discourses by learning to listen to the other, by learning to, do what I really like Destiny's story about, how Adichie had engaged with this controversy around culture. I don't think I knew about it before, but just to think about ways in which perhaps for some individuals who who feel like they have more stakes in, the future of the state to actually settle down to listen to others and find ways they can be in these conversations. But the second thing about, on the other side of the herd mentality is the idea that we must not also be condescending and dismissive of the so-called herd. Because like I said in my response about Mobad, it was clear from the interviews that I did that, people weren't just flocking out because someone had asked them to. People had specific personal grievances that they felt like within that frame of political mobilization, they could articulate. And so to see the ways in which we can be more generous to the herd and think about how individuals are within them, rationalizing their actions, rationalizing their political alliance, and how we can do the intellectual work of cohort building. So Gramsci talks about hegemony, and his idea of hegemony shifting is that we have to go out and do, the work of bringing people, like drawing, like actually becoming evangelists, as it were, to draw people on our side, because that's how hegemonies are built. That's how the state works, because it's able to, legitimize its claims through all these platforms, build some kind of hegemony and stabilize that. And so the work of countercultures, the work of resistance must be to come back and find ways in which we can do that work of reconstituting political cohorts, mobilizing people together in ways that are meaningful and sustainable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. I was going to come out. Yeah, but yeah, thank you very much for that final thought. The whole fact that even the head itself has some form of, agency to self-reflect and also participate in some of these discourses because of their own personal experiences, or even vicarious experiences, like we saw during the NSAS protest where youth, trooped out, because they also had a stake in the movement. So thank you very much for that brilliant closing remark. I will go to, I think, Destiny, then Hasana.
Yeah, I've taken enough time already, so I'll make this very short. I think what I want to say as a closing remark is just to encourage the panelists and pretty much everybody listening that these conversations are very important. They may not have immediate practical effects, but at the very least, they reinforce our conviction. And we may be in certain positions tomorrow where we can actually, tangibly affect systems. And these convictions that have been over time reinforced, they will come to bear. So Noah, thank you very much for putting this together. It is and that's why I've always been a fan of what you do, the conversation, because I know that this is very important. It's important because just like Jekara said and Hazana, if you think about the conversations that we just had or the issues that we brought up, from religion to how women are seen, from culture and all of these things, it boils down to one singular question. If Nigeria is this messed up, what is the cause of it? Mentality. How do you change a people's minds? It is an extremely difficult task, and it begins with having these conversations. So they may not, the advantages are long-term, but every time we have them, they are extremely important, because God only knows the multiplier effect that we can set the tone for that would then actually change a whole generation. So I just want to say, whenever we have opportunities or platforms or spaces in which we can talk about these things like subcultures, even from the seemingly tangential to the most important and most crucial political issues, we should actually have those conversations, because sometimes it feels like a betrayal. All of this education that we have, I mean, every single person speaking here has probably done a master's, doing a PhD, and so we can't just amass all of that knowledge, exposure, and then don't share it. So I mean, we can, practically speaking, but it just feels like a betrayal. And I think we at least owe it to people to have this conversation and just maybe reinforce their convictions on what is right as opposed to what is wrong. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I absolutely enjoyed, listening to Dekara, Hazana, and yourself.
Thank you very much, Destiny, for that. When I made a reference to Edward Said's representations of the intellectual, it's because I really find the book, I believe everyone should try and read it if they can, very useful for any society. And it just shows that, which is also in a sense a bit antithetical to Plato's The Republic, which also, Said's argument that everyone in society has one role that they play. Intellectuals themselves don't necessarily have to be people within institutions of learning, but people who have very specific and important role to play in the society. So I don't take you all for granted, for coming on. We don't take you for granted at the conversation, for your input, for your wonderful and brilliant submissions. So I'm just going to go briefly to Asana.
Everything Dekara and Destiny have said, everything adopted. And I'm just going to add just like a few words. First things first, I think the culture of violence that we have is not all bad. And I don't want people to leave thinking that, it's all bad, especially because it's such a young people's culture. And like we've seen how that has helped, in holding government accountable, in holding seemingly powerful people accountable, and I think we've also seen how that has challenged the respectability politics that culture that we have, that, Destiny seems to be so worried about, which I completely agree. But we've seen how this violence, or the Vawulence, with the W has challenged, or, constantly keeps on challenging, this culture that we have, with the Gen Zs. If you do anyhow, you will see anyhow, they would drag you to shreds. So I don't think it's all bad, Of course, there are rooms, to work on, but I think it has done so much, in terms of holding public officials accountable. Can it be worked on? Yes, And then lastly, just to also say that, as young people, I hope that we can also learn to be able to work together, even if we don't necessarily like each other, because, when you're building Rome, when you're building a city, when you're building, you don't necessarily have to like people that you work with, but, we should be able to at least work together, respect each other's opinion, even if we don't necessarily like each other. And on that note, thank you so much, for bringing these brilliant people together. I'm so honored to have spoken here, Thank you for everything that you do, Noah. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Hasana. When you were talking about respectability culture, I remember that reminded me of Maya Star's backlash on the digital space. I think 2 days ago, thereabout, when people were like Maya Star. I mean, that just provides a sort of point of discourse on how, as people are, like the danger of the concept of globalization itself, how global social media tends to homogenize, cultures, in a sense that people begin to believe that their own culture, like there's a certain level, there's a certain social expectation, that people should kowtow to. I grew up in a very multi-ethnic society. I grew up in Benue, where you had people, had Igbos, had Yorubas, had Tivs, had Idomas, had Hausas from different parts of the world. And it was just very interesting to see how all of these differences, sort of overlap in a sense, and how people could, maybe because we are all made up of cognitive biases, that are formed by our social identity, our cultural beliefs, and our experiences generally. And how do we create accommodations? How do we have the grace to understand that sometimes, the way people think is based off, where they come from, their history, their experiences, and just understand that we need to be more accommodating and graceful. So I just want to say thank you all for coming, and thank you all for your brilliant conversations. I'm just going to open the floor for the audience. Anyone who has a question should please come forth and ask the panelists.
Please check the chat box.
Oh, okay. Kumi, do you want to ask a question in person or?
No, no. I've already registered the question on the chat box.
I can't find any question from any of the panelists. But for me, do you have any questions in particular?
Okay, I'll just read what I have on the chat box here.
Okay.
Is it that we can't see the chat box? We can't see what's on the chat box.
No, I can't.
Oh, okay. Well, I sort of asked the questions, but it's a little bit noisy here. I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, yes.
The first one, I said, thank you, Asana, for that powerful take. I think in relation to the idea of the woman being expected to be good and just good alone. So I said, I am thinking about how religion and culture have contributed to the wiring of ethics and morality into the personality of humanness. So definitely I started unpacking the role of culture in moralizing the woman. And I am thinking about how religion and its relation to moralizing the woman is somewhat a tough nut to crack, but it's something to actually talk about this. I would like them to, like, anyone of the panelists to talk about this. So what role has religion and culture played in moralizing the woman, and what can be done about it? That is the first thing I asked. Then the second thing I said is also sometimes violence is necessary. Zizek quite much elaborates on this. If ideologies are going to be constructed and beautified in ways that make for change, there might be a need to match violence. The case of Debbie, that is Mommy C, is an example. The act of rewarding her for being one kind of woman is some kind of violence. A sort of love bombing, often practiced by patriarchs. Sugar Belly was one antagonist against the patronage of her Mom C. She was insulted and maligned, and to stand on ground, she had to be violent. On the opposite side is Ife Dayo Akoro, which is the diary of a Nigerian girl, which is quite popular, whose submission about the issue felt like a betrayal, a validation of the forcefulness with which Momzi's words were held to charitable standards. So, how then do we know what violence is good and necessary? Like, what is the French Revolution of violence? That French Revolution that gets us to the other side. So those are my two either submissions, questions here.
Thank you, Fumi, for your brilliant questions. I would like to ask the panelists, did we all get the questions?
Can the panelists see what is on the chat box?
Yeah.
Okay, so they can.
So who would like to go first? I think Dekara was speaking about Gramsci the other time about holding forth the hegemony and the need sometimes for some form of violence, and going back to Fanon to an extent, like, and what form of violence is necessary? What form of violence do we need to maybe extrapolate into certain discourses or certain stance we hold about social issues? Is violence necessary?
This is an entire new discussion that we just, but anyway, I'll try to make it brief. I'm an unapologetic Fanon disciple, and the opening line of Wretched of the Earth is precisely this, that every act of this decolonization is necessarily violence. I'm paraphrasing now, I'm a little rusty, but it kind of shows you like the ripple effects of structural violence. The idea that violent resistance is sometimes necessary. But I feel like in a contemporary liberal moment that we have now, we have a tendency to stop reading Fanon at that chapter on violence. And Fanon's work is much more detailed than that. It tells you that, sometimes in the moment of resistance, the kind of violent response is necessary to counteract particular modes of violence. And a good example of this is when I think Angela Davis is questioned about the Black Panther, and they tell her, they ask why, Black people or her party is violent. And she says this, she said, are you asking me about violence? Black men are being shot on the streets every day just for being. And because they're raising their arms to protect their children, you're asking me about violence. So that kind of counteractive moment. But Fanon goes on to actually say that we cannot depend on the energies or the emotions of violence, that we have to stabilize a political cohort, a form of, national culture that will be around the struggles of the people. We have to deliberate on this moment, that those energies around which, those who are frustrated come to fight, they're important, but they run out. And after they've run out, what next? So it's that what next question I think we also need to ask at every critical time. Yes, there are some moments where you're like, you have to say that, no, this is enough. Enough is enough. But at each critical moment, are we able to organize a more sustainable politics?
Thank you very much, Dekara, for that. Does any one of the panelists want to contribute to that, or do we go next to the question directed at Ata?
I would have just, sorry, I just wanted to add just like, that is for me, to the gen, and culture and the ethics that women are supposed to carry.
Hasana, you're
I'm
breaking.
such a great lover of his. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but you're breaking.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, but can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can I stand here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, because Dakara spoke about Fanon, and I'm such a great fan of his work. And now that she's like, as she was talking, I just kept on thinking about violence and colonialism, and that idea of intrusion and the patriarchal, the patriarchal violence, that was kind of sort of additionally introduced to Africa, through colonialism. And even with religion also, that was also introduced to Africa through colonialism, be it the Arab trade, or the European colonialism. And I think deeply about all of these things. And I just want to let Fumi know that she has a big point on how religion and culture plays, like but I think we also need to, and that's why I also agree with Diakara when she said it's a whole new conversation. Perhaps it's going to be a topic for you for some other time. But yeah, think of all of these things and just think about how that forms the version of the woman that were made to aspire to today, and how un-African that is, or how or how tainted even in its Africanness because of colonialism and imported religion and so on. So yeah, just wanted to point that.
Thank you very much, Masina. Destiny, do you want to?
No, I'm not going to add to that. Unfortunately, that's not something I know too much about to provide a good response. And I think I'm just here to learn, and I have indeed learned from what dear Karen has done and said.
Thank you very much, Destiny. I think we can accommodate one more question from the audience before we call it a day. Is there any question that anyone would like to ask? And I also like to ask that you can also send in the chat box. You can send your email address, so you would get the next you get a newsletter for the next conversation we are going to be organizing. But if there is no any other question, I think we can end on this note. All right, yeah. So please, you can quickly, please send your email address, to get the next newsletter. But I just want to once again thank Hasana, Kara, and Destiny, for showing up whenever we ask them to. Your submissions have been very brilliant and profound. And we just want to say at the conversation that we do appreciate you, and we are very grateful that you are here. Thank you also, our wonderful audience, for being a wonderful part of this conversation. we hope that you have, been able to, learn from our wonderful panelists, and we hope that we see you next time when we have our next conversation. So I think on this note we can end. Thanks for coming. See you next time.